Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The sun rises without asking permission in the hills of 13th century northern Italy, outside the old walls of Milan. The monks of a Benedictine monastery began their day as they had for centuries, not by counting minutes, but by watching shadows. You must understand, time in the medieval world was not what it is now. It did not tick. It did not divide the day into sterile blocks. It flowed like weather and fixed, interpretive. The bell rang for prayer when the sun was at a certain angle on the stone lintel. Meals happened when the shadow reached the edge of the well. To be a monk in this monastery was to live not by time, but by rhythm. The rhythm of work, prayer, fasting, silence. Clock dictated their obedience. Only the light and the seasons did. And then something changed. The arrival of the unwanted machinist came not with fanfare, but with a wooden cart and 2 apprentices. Clockmaker from Padua had been invited, some said by the abbot. Others whispered it was the doing of a visiting bishop. The device he brought was not small. It was housed in a wooden tower nearly the size of a wardrobe. The counterweight a stone and a virgin foliate escapement made of iron and wood. It was primitive, but it worked, and more importantly, it ticked. This was no sundial, no clepsydra, quietly leaking water in the dark. This was a machine that insisted on being heard. It measured seconds. It rang bells, not when the monks sensed it was time to pray, but when the gears declared it so. For the monks, it created a kind of dissonance, because suddenly, the time they had known through light and shadow was wrong. Time, as disciplined the abbot, at first welcomed the device. He believed it would bring order to the community. The bell for matins could now ring at the exact moment before dawn, regardless of weather or season. Compline would no longer drift slowly into the night. Even the cooks in the monastery kitchen were told to begin boiling the lentils when the gear struck the 3rd mark. But soon, friction emerged. Brother Ensaldus, a beekeeper and scribe, was the first to voice concern. "We are monks," he wrote in his marginalia, "not accountants of the hours." He worried the clock introduced something dangerous. Precision, not precision in worship, but precision in obedience. No longer could a brother linger in prayer or reflection. The bell rang, and the wheel turned, and that was that time. Once sacred and sensed, was becoming mechanical, impersonal. And that brother Ensaldus feared was a kind of theft. The bell that rang through silence one night in early spring, silence, thicker than usual, fell over the cloister. A thick fog had rolled in from the west, wrapping the stone in white. The usual rustling of habits and clatter of morning prayer was replaced with stillness. And then, at precisely 3 hours past midnight, the mechanical bell rang, not once, not twice, but 13 times. It was a malfunction later blamed on a broken pen. But in that moment, something snapped in the community's resolve. 13 chimes when there should have been none. A false summons. A jarring intrusion. The monks had long obeyed silence as a form of reverence. But that night, the silence turned to resistance. Because if a machine could summon you falsely in the dark, then it could also tell lies in the light. The disassembly. The next morning, the abbot found the machine still ticking. The apprentices, frightened, insisted it was a mistake of construction. A gear to warn, a misaligned wheel. It would be fixed. But Brother Ensaldus and 3 others had already written a petition. The monastery, they argued, was not meant to be ruled by invention. So the rule of Saint Benedict did not require mechanical time. It required Devotion. Clocks, no matter how clever, could not measure devotion. The decision came quietly. That afternoon, the device was removed from the chapel tower. The apprentices packed their tools, and the stone counterweight was lowered to the ground. But the bell was left behind, no longer attached to the clockwork. It sat mute for many years till it rusted in place and was finally removed. What was lost in it? What was it curiously? No one smashed the machine. They could have burned it, dismantled it into parts, repurposed the metal. Instead, it was placed in the corner of the scriptorium, still intact, but disconnected. A reminder, perhaps, not of failure, but of a decision. The monks returned to their older ways. Shadow on stone, angle of the sun, scent of dew in the air. And for many decades after, the monastery kept no ticking clock, only silence and song. But the clockmaker's visit had not gone unnoticed elsewhere in nearby towns. Merchants had heard of a machine that could chime on its own in cathedrals. Bishops began to ask if perhaps the hours of prayer could be harmonized between distant cities and in the towers of municipal halls. New bells began to be forged. At the monastery, though, the choice was clear. Real time was not something to be forced. It was to be sensed, lived through. So why then, you might wonder, did the monks not simply return the machine? Why did they keep it? Why did they leave it in the scriptorium, silent but whole? Exactly. Were they afraid of breaking if they smashed it? Or what were they hoping might someday be remembered? The silence that followed the removal of the mechanical clock was not, as some might imagine, a triumphant one. It was awkward, pregnant with something unresolved. The clock had not been exiled with violence, nor welcomed with reverence. It had been left in limbo, stored like a manuscript written in a tongue no one wanted to read. The scriptorium was a quiet place, even by monastic standards. Here, the clock was placed beside a shelf of unused vellum, covered with a cloth made from worn habits. Dust settled quickly on the iron. The apprentices had left without resistance, heading back to Padua, their cart lighter than it had arrived. No payment had been refused, but no letter of recommendation had been given either. It was as if the monks had decided to forget the entire experiment. But forgetting, as you know, is rarely so simple. The monks who remembered differently while the monastery returned to its traditional routines, prayer by candlelight, meals by the slant of the sun, hours marked not in numbers, but in rituals. Not all of the brothers forgot the machine. A few remembered it fondly. Brother Hugo, the monastery's aging herbalist, had often stood near the wooden housing just to listen, claimed the tick had soothed his nerves during long evenings preparing salves. He missed it. Brother Matthias, the baker, had found the morning bell reliable, even comforting. He said the bread was always better when pegged on the clock's rhythm. But neither man dared say so out loud. To speak in favor of the clock was to suggest the monastery had erred, and to say that aloud was to question the abbot's spiritual authority. Wasn't done, so instead they remembered in silence, quiet affection, never voiced, and the clock, for its part, stayed silent too. A city that thought differently in Milan, 40 miles away, things were changing. There, the cathedral chapter had commissioned a timekeeper for the bell tower. Not a human, but a mechanism. A newer clock, larger and more complex, was being designed by a craftsman who'd heard rumors of a prototype built by a man from Padua who was never invited back. This time, the city wanted a public clock, one that could ring out across rooftops and guide merchants, tailors, notaries, and bakers alike. Time was becoming commerce, coordination, taxation, and in the monasteries. This was noticed. A delegation from the bishop's office visited the cloister the following autumn. They brought with them questions disguised as compliments. How did the monks keep such orderly hours without mechanical aid. They considered lending their silent device to the cathedral builders for study. The abbot offered tea, but no invitation to view the clock. It did not suit us, he said, quietly, and that was all. The argument that wasn't about time by the second year after the clock's removal. A curious debate began to take shape, not about machinery, but about time itself. Some monks argued that mechanical time was a human vanity, that it tried to impose symmetry where none was intended. That even the sun, when measured by shadow, wobbled with the seasons and danced with imperfection. Why should the bell toll with the same tone at dawn and dusk, in summer and winter? Shouldn't divine time be irregular, like weather, like grace? Others, quietly, disagreed. Brother Thaddeus, a young copyist, had read manuscripts from Paris and Toulouse describing clocks in other abbeys. He knew what they were becoming. Not novelties, but instruments of alignment. He suspected the future would not ring with silence, but he, too, said nothing. He simply copied, and the clock stayed under his cloth. The quiet Testone winter morning, before the bells of Lauds, Brother Matthews did something peculiar. He walked to the scriptorium, uncovered the clock, and checked its weight. Dust coated the mechanism, but it was intact. He oiled the hinges as best he could with lamp fat. Then, slowly, he began to wind it. He had no authority to do this. He was not the sacristan, not the abbot, not even particularly favored. But he was curious, and when the gears began to turn again, the first tick echoed off the cold stone like a remembered breath. He did not ring the bell. He left that disconnected. But, for 5 hours, the gears ticked. Brother Matthews sat beside it in silence. He did not record the time. He did not pray. He just listened. When the weight reached the bottom, the mechanism stopped, and he covered it again. The visit from the clockmaker's son, it was nearly 6 years after the clock's removal that a stranger came to the monastery gates, holding a small wooden box. He was the son of the original clockmaker. His father had died the previous spring. Still bitter, some said, about the monastery that had rejected his invention. But before his death, he had written one final letter, addressed not to the abbot, but to the monks who still remember. Inside the box were several iron gears, delicately carved. Not from the old design, but new. The son asked no favors. He said he only wished to see where the machine had stood. Brother Hugo, older now, welcomed him in. They did not discuss theology, or silence, or rebellion. They simply removed the cloth, and the son touched the old housing with his fingertips. As one might touch the stones of a ruin, he smiled. Then he left. The meaning of refusal. The monastery never returned the machine to Cassius' use, but neither did they discard it. And over time, the story of the clock took on a strange life. New novices were told of it during long walks or while tending the vines. Not as heresy, not as warning, but as curiosity. A lesson, not in failure, but in discernment. You see, they had not rejected technology. Not really. They had rejected what it meant in that moment. The feeling of something imposed rather than invited. They had refused precision, not progress. They had refused enforcement, not innovation. They had, in their own way, preserved something. Slower, more human. But of course, one must ask, if the clock had been gentler, if it had rung not with tyranny, but with invitation, would they still have taken it down? And what would their days have looked like then? The wooden housing of the first clock had cracked slightly with age. Not from use, there hadn't been much of that, but from time itself. Wood, unlike iron, warps in stillness. The less it is touched, the more it remembers its own growth, pulling inward like a tree turned inside out. By the time Brother Hugo died, no monk alive could quite recall when the cloth had first been laid across it. There were whispers, of course. The sacristan believed it had once marked the evening bell more precisely than any man. A novice once asked whether it was true that the gears used to glow in candlelight like a quiet forge, but no one had ever heard it ring still. It remained unpolished, undisturbed, but never forgotten. A generation that didn't ask why. The monks who entered the order in the decades that followed were of a different world. They arrived having already seen clocks in towers, in workshops, even in city halls. They came from towns where the noon bell was not rung by hand, but by gears. They had already learned to mark time in quarters and halves, to break days into measurable increments, to feel the strange comfort of regularity. Yet none of them thought to revive the monastery's abandoned machine. Why? Because it had become part of the monastery's identity, not the machine itself. But the refusal, it was no longer simply a tool left idle. It was a choice. A kind of monastic silence wrapped in wood and iron. To rewind it would be to question. Something too deep, too embedded, too quiet. And so, the clock remained where it was, not forgotten, but absorbed, like an unread psalm left bookmarked on a shelf. The cartographer who counted hours differently was a visiting scholar and old friend of Brother Thaddeus, long since retired from copying, who asked the question no monk had voiced in nearly 40 years. She arrived from Bologna with dusty boots and a cracked map case, requesting 2 nights' lodging and access to the monastery's astronomical tables. Her name was Constanza, and she had once studied horology, the art of timekeeping, not for philosophy, but for practical use. "I heard," she said over lentil soup, "that your abbey once refused a clock." The monks paused. It was true, but no one had called it that before. A refusal, not a mistake, not a failure, a decision. Brother Lucien, who kept the apothecary, answered gently, "We didn't so much refuse it as decide not to obey it." She smiled. "Even better, I can't." Then she asked if she could see it. The measurement of dust. They took her to the scriptorium on the second evening. 3 candles lit the space, though the moon was nearly full. The air was thick with lavender oil and dry parchment. The cloth was still there, folded with care, not ceremony. Constanza stood before it silently for a long time, and then, without asking permission, she pulled back the cloth. The clock was intact. Its iron belly was rusted in patches, but the central wheel still turned under gentle pressure. She leaned close, sniffed the gear shafts, and nodded. "Beeswax and old oil," she murmured. "Smells like a cathedral in March." Brother Lucien asked what she meant. She only said it could run again. But no one moved to wind it. The last gear what Constanza left behind was not a map, as they had expected, but a small note tucked inside the clock's wooden casing. It read, "Time obeys no bell, but men do." Okay, and in choosing silence, you created your own calendar. For many monks, that sentence became something of a riddle. Some thought it was praise, others, quiet rebuke. But for those who had always suspected the monastery had not turned away from time itself, but only from a particular version of it, the note was confirmation. They had rejected the rule of time, not its passing, and perhaps, in doing so, they had preserved something older, something slower, something closer to the way leaves follow the wind, not a bell. When the bell didn't ring one winter evening, many years later, a sudden frost caused the rope on the main chapel bell to stiffen and crack. Could not be rung in the morning. The monks, rising in darkness, found themselves momentarily uncertain. Was it law its prime? Too early? It's too late. They lit candles anyway, prayed, and ate a bit of bread warmed in coals. No one suggested using the mechanical clock. It was there, of course, still covered, still untouched, but it remained silent, and the day unfolded anyway, as it always had. The visitors, who came for the wrong reason centuries past. Eventually, the monastery opened a small guest house for pilgrims. Among the visitors came curious tourists, historians, and once even a film crew. They all asked to see the clock. By then, it was behind glass, still intact, still unwound. A placard explained, "This is believed to be one of the earliest mechanical clocks ever built in Italy. It was never adopted by the monks of this abbey, not due to ignorance, but by a deliberate choice. They preferred the rhythm of bells rung by hand, the clouds to signal dusk, the wind to mark evening. The clock has not run since the 14th century, but time has never stopped, and so the clock became a symbol not of timekeeping, but of the refusal to be kept." Final reflections. The clock that waited you could say that this first clock failed, that it was not accepted, not loved, not obeyed, but perhaps it succeeded more quietly than we know. It reminded its creators that time was not just numbers and bells, but breath and silence and rhythm and grace. It reminded the monks that not everything new must be followed. And it reminded the world eventually that progress isn't only about moving forward. Sometimes it's about staying still long enough to ask what exactly we're following. So the next time you hear a bell ring, mechanical, digital, or human, pause. For a moment, ask yourself not what time it is, but whose time it is, and whether you must answer. The tower stood at the highest edge of the village, where the winds were uninvited and the crows held their parliament. It had been there long before the people who now passed it every day, before the school was built, before the market widened, before the alleyways lost their names. It rose from a base of pale stone, bricks that chipped not from neglect, but from age. At its top sat a round face, solemn and expressionless, its hands still, its numerals fading, and its heart untouched, because no one wanted to wind it. There were many reasons, but no official one. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was inconvenient. Still others said it was simply unnecessary. After all, there were watches now, and church bells, and later phones. Time, like air, was everywhere. No one needed a tower to count it, but still it stood, and still it waited, not broken, not forgotten, just deliberately unused. Not out of laziness, but something quieter, something less explainable. And so, the clock became something else, not a tool, not a landmark, a presence. The first clockmaker who didn't stay the original clockmaker, his name was Aldwin, or perhaps Aldrich, depending on which parish record you believed came from a town that valued bells. He arrived with 2 apprentices, a wagon filled with brass, and a letter of commission signed by the mayor's seal. That was 1733. He set to work immediately, measured the angle of the sun, adjusted for the slope of the hill, ordered the iron cogs to be recast when the first batch clicked too loudly in cold air. He had worked on clocks before, but never one so prominent. This one would be different. It would be honest, he said. Not merely decorative. It would mark time so precisely that people would forget to look elsewhere. And perhaps that was the first mistake, because people don't always want to forget their own sense of time. By the 3rd year, the tower was finished. The face was installed. The gearworks, delicately placed behind stone and wood, were calibrated to run with astonishing smoothness. It only needed to be wound once every 8 days, which was considered a marvel at the time. The townspeople gathered for the inaugural winding. They clapped politely. Someone brought roasted chestnuts, and then the clock rang noon, a deep, unwavering bell, and in that moment, the town began to lose interest. The bell that didn't match the birds you see. Before the clock, people had relied on many things to tell the hour. The market crier who set up at dawn, the warmth of bread in the baker's lane, the school children released when shadows reached a certain cobblestone. The town had time, yes, but it was felt, not measured, and now this foreign bell, deep, metallic, absolute, had overwritten it. At first, people tried to adjust. Shopkeepers closed a little earlier. The postman shifted his route. Mothers tried to call their children inside just before the next chime. But something didn't fit. The bell always seemed slightly off, a few minutes early or late, or exactly right, but wrong. The crows didn't change their flight. The baker still woke before it rang. The sun still warmed the church wall after the clock had declared midday, and the people began to whisper, "It doesn't understand us." The first week it was forgotten. By the 5th year, the apprentices had moved on. The clockmaker had grown older, slower, and eventually died in a chair near the tower base. He left no sons, only a set of keys and a meticulously inked instruction book signed at the bottom with a note, "For whomever understands time." No. One claimed the title. At first, the council appointed a caretaker, a young man who climbed the stairs every 8th day, wound the crank, and oiled the gears. But his hand grew blistered. He complained of stiffness in the tower's air, a kind of heaviness. He resigned after 3 months. The next was an older woman who'd once kept bees. She said she liked gears. She stayed longer, but one winter she forgot to wind it, and no one noticed for a week when she went to correct it. The tower door was stuck. She took it as a sign and never returned. Time without the clock, strangely. The town did not suffer. People woke with the same rhythm. School children were still dismissed at the same angle of shadow. The shops opened and closed with familiarity, not calculation. The council debated removing the mechanism. One member suggested melting it down for tools. Another proposed converting the tower into a library. But the vote never passed, because deep down, everyone felt that the clock should remain, just not run. There was a kind of comfort in its stillness, in knowing time could be measured, but wasn't, that it sat there, gears unwound, hands resting in silence. Like a wise old friend who had chosen not to speak, visitors who asked too many questions over the years. Travelers came through. Some admired the tower's architecture. Few asked if it still worked. Yes, people would say, "We just don't wind it." That always confused them. Why not? And no one could quite answer. There was no rule, no curse, no tragedy. Just a collective decision, never spoken, never written, only felt. Some travelers offered to wind it themselves. They were politely refused. Once, a professor from the city offered a sum of money to film its inner workings. He was allowed to see the gears gleaming, preserved, almost humming with anticipation. He called it a miracle of restraint, but he, too, was not given the key. The child who almost turned the crank there was one exception. A child, barely 10, who loved stories of machines. She found the key in the town archives, still wrapped in cloth, tucked inside a box marked Misc, brass. No one had looked inside in years. She brought it to her father, the librarian. He stared at it for a long time and said nothing. Later that week, she climbed the tower steps alone. The door creaked open without resistance. The stairs welcomed her with dust and silence. She reached the gear chamber, heart thudding. She placed the key into the slot. It fit perfectly. She turned it once. The gear moved, and then she stopped because she remembered something her grandmother had said once while pointing to the tower. That clock doesn't keep time. It keeps memory. And memory, she decided, was best left unwound. She placed the key on the ledge and left. It dares. The sound it never made deaf. You stand beneath the tower on a still night. You might feel it, not hear it, not see it, but feel it. A presence, a question not asked. A bell that might ring, but doesn't, and that is its gift. A timekeeper that keeps nothing. A monument to silence, to restraint. To a village that once heard a bell and said, "Not yet, not now, maybe never, but still, maybe, someday," because the key is still there, and time even unwound, is always waiting. There are some decisions so old, so softly held, that they no longer need to be spoken aloud, like the time of year when to prune a certain tree, or which stones to avoid when stepping across a creek, or, in the case of this town, why the clock must never be wound. No meeting had been held, no resolution passed, but still, everyone understood. The silence of the clock had become a kind of rhythm in itself, Beatles' pulse that wrapped around daily life, gentle and strange, like fog, that never lifts but never becomes oppressive. Generations passed, and the tower stood. Its face remained pale, its hands unmoving, pointed forever at a time no one needed to remember. And below it, life moved on, slow, ordinary, human. The librarian who counted days without hours, the town librarian, Mr. Ellery by name, had kept a careful record of every time a traveler asked about the clock. He had a small, green notebook labeled Inquiries Re, the tower, and in it, each page was marked by season. Summer brought the most curiosity, winter the least. He never offered explanations, only recorded the questions. Does it still work? Can it be restored? Why is the face so clean if it isn't used? May I try the key? Every question was followed by a short answer. Yes, no, unknown, denied. What made Mr. Ellery unusual wasn't that he maintained the notebook, but that he also maintained the tower. He swept its steps once a month, dusted the interior of the gear chamber, and gently polished the brass crank just once a year. On the summer solstice, he didn't wind it. He never intended to, but he wanted it to feel ready, just in case. The summer the key disappeared was a small event, but it shook the town more than anyone admitted. One morning, the green-wrapped key left on the ledge near the gears since the child's visit decades ago was gone. At first, no one said anything, but word spread, as it always does in places where time lingers rather than hurries. Had someone wounded? Had someone taken it? Had the clock itself accepted it? Mr. Ellery checked the gear housing. No tension, no coil engaged. The hands remained fixed at their ancient angle. Nothing had moved. Still, he wrote it in the notebook. Summer, year 78. Key missing. Tower unwound. He said nothing more. The elder who remembered the sound. There were still a few in the village who remembered the bell. Not many. Fewer every year. One of them was an elder named Hester, who lived in the cottage nearest the tower's base. Her family had been caretakers of the church garden, which lay in the shadow of the tower's long afternoon shadow dot. As a child, she remembered the clock being wound just once when the mayor's cousin had come to visit. It was a moment of vanity, done not for need, but for pride. They had rung the bell at noon precisely. She had covered her ears. It was too loud for such a small town, he said softly when asked. It didn't sound like it belonged. When the key went missing, people began to visit her more often, as if she might remember some forgotten rule, some buried instruction. She didn't, but she did offer this. Maybe it's not about the sound the clock makes. It's about the sound we make when it's silent. And that was all. The man who tried to rebuild the instruction manual one day. A man arrived carrying a canvas bag filled with photocopies. His name was Dr. Vellum, a historian of rural horology, the study of timekeeping in forgotten places. He had heard of the clock through an old pamphlet and traveled for days by train and 2 hours by bicycle just to see it. He wasn't interested in winding it. He wanted to understand it. With the council's quiet permission, he stayed in the tower for a week. He didn't sleep there. He slept in the upstairs room at the inn, but each day he brought sandwiches, a thermos, and 3 notebooks. He sketched every cog, noted every scrape of metal, every curve in the teeth of the gear wheels. He confirmed that the mechanism was still perfectly functional, and he confirmed something else. It had been designed to last for centuries, if used gently. It's as if the maker expected it not to be used constantly. He said to Mr. Ellery, or Ellery replied, as if he expected us to choose not to. Dr. Vellum made no argument. Before leaving, he left a copy of his field notes in the library. On the final page, he had written a single line. A clock, unwound, is not broken. It is resting. The clock face there refused to fade, despite all this, despite decades of weather, of wind and rain, of dust and snow. The clock face had never yellowed. The numerals remained clear. The iron hour and minute hands bore no rust. The glass over, the face remained UNCRACK. It was as though the passage of time left the timekeeper alone. Children began to ask why. One teacher speculated that the elevation helped. Another said the stonework beneath the face must protect it from shifts in temperature. But still, it felt unusual. One winter, a snowstorm encased the tower in frost. Power lines failed. Shops closed. Trees cracked under the weight of ice. And, still, the face of the clock peered out and touched, almost glowing. At exactly 7:14, according to every wristwatch and phone in the Villiers, single icicle fell from the tip of the hour hand. No one forgot it, but no one mentioned it directly. The whisper that came every spring, there was a local saying, passed quietly in the schoolyard and over fence rails. If the clock ever moves again, it will be on its own. What that means, no one fully knows. Some say the wind might turn the gears. One day, others think the tower knows when to begin again. Once, when spring came early, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night inside the clock chamber. They made it until midnight, then left, suddenly and silently. They never spoke of it, but one of them wrote on a desk in the school. It sounded like breathing. Desk was sanded down the following term, but the phrase never left the minds of those who saw it. And so, the tower remained unwound, untouched, and perhaps alone. There are towns that mark time with bells, with whistles, with great iron chimes. This was not that kind of town. And yet, over the years, no one had ever been late, not meaningfully. The butcher opened when the sun warmed the stones. The school rang a small, handheld bell. The farmers arrived with the mist and left with the fading gold of afternoon. The tower did not tick, yet everything moved. That was the strange part. The builder's letter that no one could read in the attic of the council archive lay under a drawer marked unknown correspondence. Lay a scroll with no date, no seal, and no name. Had been folded inside itself 3 times and tied with simple linen thread. For years, it was assumed to be a record of grain tax, something common, unurgent, probably illegible, until a visiting archivist, cataloging old papers, unfolded it out of curiosity. The language was an older dialect of the town's own, archaic but readable. Its first line was a quiet confession. I built the clock, but not for keeping time. The rest of the letter read like a dream. It described a period of sickness, an era of grief in the builder's life when each hour felt like a hammer. The ticking of other clocks had become unbearable, the passing of minutes, too sharp. He built this one, not to mark time, but to pause it, a monument to the stillness he longed for. Not to command life, but to soften it. He'd given the key to the council, asking that it only be used when people forgot how to rest. No name was signed, but the handwriting matched an old design ledger stored in the same attic, stamped with a single faded symbol, a tower without hands. The man who brought his own clock there was a brief moment. A few years back, when someone tried to bring time back to the tower. His name was Otto, and he was a mechanic from the city. He had married into the village and arrived with metal tools, a small radio, and a polished brass pocket watch. Otto was not rude or arrogant. In fact, he was thoughtful and kind, but he didn't understand the silence. He often remarked that the tower was underused, that time could be harnessed. He volunteered to wind it. The council declined. Otto shrugged and built a small sundial outside his home. It was elegant, simple, and told accurate time for 3 months, until one morning it cracked in half. No storm, no vandalism, just a quiet, split shadow across the lawn. Otto did not rebuild it. He kept his pocket watch, but stopped offering it to others. And, curiously, he began showing up to town meetings 5 minutes late, never apologized the day the tower was touched. It happened on a Wednesday. The school had taken the children to the field for botany. The bakery was halfway through its second batch. The birds had not yet finished their morning circles. And yet, for some reason perhaps, a ripple in habit, perhaps coincidence, someone noticed that the tower's door was ajar, not open, not broken, just ajar. Mr. Ellery, now in his 80s, shuffled down the path with his cane and entered first. Everything was exactly as it had always been. The brass crank was polished, untouched. The gears were oiled, unmoved. The green ribbon, where the key once lay, was still folded, flat and still, and on the floor was a single gray feather. No bird in sight. He picked it up, looked around, and closed the door again. No report was filed, but the story was known by dusk. Someone whispered, "Maybe it's the tower keeping us in check." But the children were taught by now. The silence of the clock had a place in the school curriculum. Not formally, of course, but woven into questions, into moments. A teacher might ask, what if time didn't need measuring to matter? Or, why? Do you think the tower hasn't changed while everything else has? Children would draw pictures of the clock face, unmoving above seasons in bloom. They would guess what time it was stuck on. 7:14 was most agreed upon, though a few insisted it was 2:46 if the sun hit it just right. No one was ever corrected, and every year a new student would ask, couldn't we just fix it? The teacher would reply, it isn't broken. That was the first lesson in philosophy they ever received, and most wouldn't forget it. The woman who listened at the door on her morning walks. A woman named Ilna would stop by the tower in place, her hand on the doorframe. She wasn't waiting for anything. She just liked to listen sometimes. She said she could hear wind inside the stone. Other times, the hum of old tension in the gears. Once, she said she heard 2 clicks, evenly spaced, as if the tower had stretched and remembered its purpose for a moment. Ilna wasn't odd. She ran the post office, but she had a way of noticing things that didn't announce themselves once. After a mild tremor shook the nearby hills, she told a friend, the clock didn't flinch. When asked what she meant, she simply said, time is not afraid. The tower's only complaint, it's worth noting that in all the years the clock remained unwound. There was only one recorded incident of maintenance. The weather vane atop the tower, a simple iron arrow, had rusted and stuck facing east. A blacksmith, long retired, volunteered to fix it. He climbed the ladder, oiled the joint, and tapped it twice with a soft mallet. It spun freely again. As he descended, he noted something unusual. The air around the clock's face felt warmer than the wind elsewhere on the roof, almost as if the stone itself held heat, like a hearth that had never quite gone out. He kept that to himself, but he left a small wooden carving near the base of the vane, a star with no points, smooth and round. It's still there. No one touches it. The record that will never be broken, in the corner of the town library. Mr. Ellery's notebook sits behind a glass case, not because he requested it, but because, when he passed, the librarian found that the last page had been torn out. There was no sign of it anywhere in his home. His notes were otherwise intact, his estate orderly, and yet that final page, the one meant to record the future, had vanished. Some say he took it with him. Others say he burned it. A few suggest he left it in the tower, tucked between the gears, waiting to be read, only when the hands begin to move. But no one has opened the clock since, and no one intends to. Stillness as a kind of wisdom, so the tower remains, unmoving, unspoken, but not ignored. People still pass by it, glance up, and adjust their pace ever so slightly, as if aligning themselves with something deeper than ours, as if remembering that time is not always measured by motion. Perhaps it's not about rebellion or nostalgia. Perhaps it's simply a reminder that not all things are better when they move, that some clocks are built not to command, but to console. That silence, in the right shape, can be sacred. And so, the hands rest. Time, in this small town, continues gently, freely, quietly, anyway, in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, under a sun that poured gold across stone courtyards and silk-draped stalls, there once stood a city that measured time in sound, shadow. It's Baghdad, not just a capital, but a mind, a city so obsessed with thought that its streets pulsed with calculation. Here, time was not simply passed, it was questioned, folded, observed, and made to work. It's not for discipline or punishment, but for curiosity. Time in Baghdad was not something you feared, right? It was something you understood, and nowhere was that more true than along the quiet edge of the Tigris River, where a scholar named Al-Zarqali once listened, not for answers, but for dripping water, a steady rhythm, a wheel turning, a measurement unfolding dot when water told the time before. The mechanical clocks of Europe would chime in churches and town squares, before pendulums swung across wooden panels, and before sand trickled through fragile bulbs of glass. There was water that fell, drop by drop, into carefully calibrated vessels. Water that moved wheels. Water that turned time into flow. Baghdad's water clocks were not crude buckets or ancient curiosities. They were engineered with elegance. Many of them resembled fountains, built not to count down a moment, but to display the passing of it. At the center of this innovation was a man rarely spoken of in modern textbooks, Ibn al-Shatir, timekeeper signed to oversee the prayer hours at one of Baghdad's mosques. But his role was more than spiritual. He was a technician of the sky, a student of stars, and a builder of something stranger, a timekeeping device that used the river itself, the wheel beneath the observatory atop. It's one of the older minarets near the House of Wisdom, our library, so vast it was said to hum with knowledge, was a quiet annex known only to a few scholars. This observatory did not boast large telescopes or grand domes. It had something far humbler, an elevated cistern and a small copper wheel. Each night, a cistern filled from a clay pipe leading back to the river. Its water slowly released through a tiny aperture. The copper wheel turned barely attached. To this wheel was a series of weighted chains, and each hour, as the water shifted balance, a small bell would chime, not unlike the soft clang of a spoon against a bowl to the casual visitor. The sound was imperceptible, metallic whisper, but to the astronomers keeping their records of the stars, it was everything. It meant you could measure sidereal time with consistency. It meant prayers could align with actual lunar calculations. It meant Baghdad was, quite literally, running on a fluid understanding of time, and yet few wrote the details down. Why timekeepers were quiet, you might assume that a society so steeped in philosophy and logic would honor its timekeepers like heroes, that their machines would be enshrined. But here is the quiet truth of Baghdad's clocks. They were always temporary. To be a timekeeper was to serve the present, not to immortalize it. The water wheel was not meant to last. Its bearings would wear. Its gears would corrode. Each season demanded repairs. Ibn al-Shatir knew this, and so did his students. One of them, a boy known only by the title Al-Rasid, or The Observer, once wrote a single line in a surviving parchment: "Time dies when it is preserved too long." The wheel, then, was not a monument. It was a song, played, heard, and forgotten like a call to prayer echoing across stone. The measurement of shadows during the hottest months, when water pressure waned, the scholars would turn to an older method: shadow measurement. On the floor of the observatory was a ring of ivory inlaid with thin brass lines. At the center stood a polished bronze penta, GNOMON. Each hour of daylight, the shadow moved across those brass lines. These weren't modern hour marks. They were divisions of a moment calculated using the sun's declination and recorded in volumes. Now, mostly lost, Ibn al-Shatir believed that every city needed its own shadow-Languesian method of measuring time based on its geography, its architecture, and even the shape of its air. That's why he never exported his blueprints. What worked in Baghdad, he said, would fail in Damascus, because time, in truth, is local. It lives where we live, and dies when we try to make it universal. When the bell stopped there was one evening recorded only in a note scribbled in the margin of a scroll. When the water wheel stopped, not broke, not rusted, just paused. No water flowed. The cistern was full, the aperture clean, but no chimes sounded that night. Ibn al-Shatir, then an old man, did not rush to fix it. He sat beside the wheel until morning, watching the stars. When asked what had happened, he replied, perhaps time needed rest. The next night, it resumed. Nothing was ever replaced. What the students wrote down, the students of Baghdad's timekeepers, didn't write manuals. They wrote observations lines in the margins, phrases in prayer books, diagrams on wax tablets. One noted how the water changed to sound as seasons shifted. Another described how pigeons would land near the wheel only during certain hours, using it, perhaps, to measure their own migrations. A third recorded how the wheel spun faster on full moon nights, as if pulled by the sky itself. Their records were personal, never systemic, which is why the clocks are gone. But the thinking remains. The quiet end of a clock one. The Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258. The House of Wisdom burned. Its books turned to ash. Its scholars dispersed, and the observatory was pulled down for its stone. The water wheel vanished. No one knows where the copper went. No drawings survived. No name was etched into marble. And yet, centuries later, Ottoman engineers would speak of a Baghdad wheel. Persian scholars would reference a river dial, and in one medieval Spanish manuscript, a translator called it el tiempo que fly, the time that flows, as if something of it remained. Even now, beneath the new city, beneath layers of mud and clay, some say you can hear water pooling through. Old broken aqueducts, not to feed fountains, but because something still turns. There are clocks that tick, and clocks that chime. And then there are clocks that whisper so faintly that only a scholar in a high stone tower, with sand in his sandals and ink on his sleeves, can tell you when they've stopped. Such was the world of Baghdad's Timekeepers, not the rulers, not the generals, just quiet observers who looked at the sky, marked the water, and listened 4 times footfall on tile. In the generations that followed the early Abbasid clockmakers, these guardians of moments became both more skilled and more invisible, because the quieter their machines became, the more people forgot to ask how they worked, and that suited the timekeepers just fine. They were not seeking fame, they were pursuing precision, and precision, as one of them once wrote, requires solitude and shadows. Why the caliphate needed clocks in the 9th century. Baghdad was a city of appointments, not because it was bureaucratic, but because it was sacred to miss a prayer by even 10 minutes could, in some interpretations, alter a believer's spiritual obligations. To call the faithful too early or too late was more than a scheduling error. It was a matter of the soul. Soul. So, the city depended on muwakkats, those trained to align prayer with astronomical truth. Each mosque had one. Some larger mosques had teams. But Baghdad's central district, near the House of Wisdom, had something different. A network. Each timekeeper maintained a segment of the day, which had their own method astrolates, gnomons, lunar tables, and water wheels, and once a week they met to compare their measurements, not for ego, but for unity. Because in Baghdad, time wasn't ruled. It was negotiated. The woman with the iron pendulum knot. All timekeepers were men. One of the most remarkable but least known figures was Fatima bint Yusuf, clockwright from Basra, who was summoned to Baghdad after an accidental fire destroyed one of the older timing towers. She did not build a new water wheel. She brought something stranger, a swinging rod suspended between two cedar beams. It wasn't a pendulum in the modern sense. It had no weights, no escapement. But Fatima had noticed that no matter how hard you pushed the rod, it returned in roughly the same arc and interval. So she built a device that swung with the wind, but measured the wind's consistency over time. At first, the Baghdad scholars dismissed her instrument. It is not time that swings, one muttered, but weather. But months later, when the river flooded and the water clocks failed, Fatima's rod still moved, unaffected by silt, silence, or shadow, and so she was accepted. For a time, her tower is now lost. But a footnote in a scroll mentions her as she who counted with wind. Another refers to her design as the iron prayer. Time that sank into the ground as the city grew. The early towers gave way to more discreet designs. Timepieces were built into courtyards, into columns, to the floors of the madrasas. In one school, tiled walkway was laid with alternating patterns that darkened as the sun moved across a narrow atrium. It created a walking shadow. Clocks to dance could glance down and know how long they had left before the next lesson. And another, a small garden pond was rigged with floating markers. Each hour, a tiny lead disc beneath the water would pull a thread that tugged the marker gently to one side. If you looked closely, seemed the flowers were rotating. In Baghdad, time wasn't something to be announced. It was something to notice. This was deliberate. In an age when Europe was measuring time to keep people working harder, Baghdad measured time to keep people aligned with nature, not for profit, but for understanding. The scholar who refused to name ours one of the most curious figures of the Baghdad tradition was Amir Khatib, a Sufi scholar who rejected traditional hour naming conventions. He argued that dividing the day into 12 or 24 segments was arbitrary and imposition of imperial order on something that was inherently fluid. Instead, he named his hours after events. The hour when the birds begin to circle the moment. When the call to prayer echoes twice the silence that precedes the date seller's shout. He taught his students to observe not numbers, but patterns, to memorize not bells, but rhythms. And so his mosque was never late, even though it had no numbers. Today, fragments of his written hour descriptions survive in a damaged manuscript housed in Istanbul. The pages are stained with saffron and river ink. Some of the lines are unreadable. Others are oddly poetic. When the dog barks 3 times, but not the 4th. When the merchant lights his 3rd lantern. When the shadow of the mosque door eats the fig leaf whole. His version of time has never been revived, but perhaps it never died. Why the clocks were buried. You might expect Baghdad's timekeeping legacy to be etched into stone, copied across empires, but it wasn't, because the Mongols came and the clocks didn't just stop, they were silenced. When Hulagu Khan's forces stormed the city in 1258, They burned libraries and flooded the streets with ash and blood. But they didn't destroy the timepieces directly. They simply ignored them. And when things are ignored, they crumble. The water wheels rotted. The sundials cracked. The gardens grew wild. The copper chains tangled in the mud. Some scholars buried their manuscripts in clay jars. A few instruments were smuggled to Damascus. One, possibly, made it to Cairo, but Baghdad, the clockwork city, lost its ticking voice, and the world moved on. What survived in silence centuries later? Ottoman engineers arrived in Baghdad with plans for new mosques, new schedules. They found some fragments in a crumbling minaret. They discovered a gear assembly etched with tiny measurements units too fine to match any known system. It was taken to Istanbul, where it vanished into a private collection. A stone water trough with a strange copper plug was unearthed in the 18th century. No one recognized it as part of a timing cistern. In 1921, during early British excavations, a bundle of rusted brass rods was recovered near the old university quarter. They were cataloged as decorative elements, but one rod was engraved, "When it rings, the moon has risen." No one paid attention where the timekeepers went. The timekeepers of Baghdad didn't vanish. They adapted. Some became astronomers in Damascus. Others joined Cairo's religious schools. A few quietly became craftsmen, hiding their skills in lantern making or carpentry. Their philosophy, the belief that time should be observed, not commanded, was slowly replaced by mechanical clocks, bells, and alarms. And yet, echoes of their worldview remain in the muwaqqids of modern mosques, who still use shadow charts, and calligraphers who arrange their letters not by rules, but by rhythm, and poets who time their recitations not by minute, but by breath. And perhaps, can you, if you've ever looked at the light outside your window and known, without checking, what hour it is, time still lives that way. When you think of a clock, you likely picture something regular, predictable. But what happens when the device isn't trying to control time, but instead trying to remember it? That was the legacy of the final water wheel in Baghdad. Not a grand machine, not a spectacle, but a quiet, humming instrument left behind by a dying scholar, designed not to chime, but to recall. A memory device. A machine that didn't just mark when the stars would rise, but recorded how long it had been since anyone had looked up to, notice, and, in the end, that may have been Baghdad's strangest contribution to the history of clocks. That time was something worth noticing, even when it no longer noticed you back. The wheel beneath the archive. In the early 13th century, a scholar named Ishaq al-Muradi occupied a modest teaching post near what was left of the once grand Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. By then, the golden age had dulled. Paper was cheaper, the scrolls were fewer, and most scientific inquiry had quietly shifted westward to Cairo and Cordoba. But Ishaq stayed. He believed something remained beneath the ruins of the old observatory, something mechanical. He wasn't an inventor. He was a compiler. Day after day, he sorted fragments, broken gnomons, rusted gears, slats of cedar engraved with notes in 6 different scripts. What he found, slowly, was a partial map of what he believed had once been the hydraulic cycle clock of Al-Rafiq, a device rumored to have measured full lunar cycles using only dripping water, floating cork weights, and inclined copper trays. No such device had ever been documented outside Baghdad. The map was incomplete, for Ishaq attempted to rebuild it, not to restore timekeeping to the city, but to preserve a memory of how it had once worked. He didn't finish, but his notebooks, copied by 2 of his students, survived in secret, passed between scholars, even as Mongol threats loomed. Clock without a face. The machine Ishaq began to rebuild was never finished in public, but according to an obscure account by a Syrian visitor in the late 1300s, Something very strange could be heard near the crumbling walls of Baghdad's oldest madrasas. It wasn't a bell or a gong. It was a low wooden knock, repeating every few minutes, followed by a hiss of draining water and a slight splash. The visitor wrote, "In the west yard, neath the reed mats, I heard the breath of something patient." It was as if the building exhaled. He asked the caretaker what it was. The answer came quietly. "The old wheel still remembers." How it worked, or might have, according to those few who studied the sketches attributed to Al-Mirati. The device did not tell the hour. It didn't track days or divide them. Instead, it simply responded to changes in moonlight and temperature. It had two components: a cistern that filled with river water and drained through a carefully shaped clay funnel, a lunar censura polished disc that expanded and contracted with temperature and reflected light from a rooftop aperture. As the moon passed through phases, the ambient night brightness shifted. The disc would warm slightly, triggering a slow tilt in a shallow cup mounted beneath it. That tilt would nudge a cork float, adjusting the rate at which the water drained into the chamber below. The result: a faint sound, a rhythm that changed as the moon did. You couldn't read it like a clock, but if you stood there long enough, you'd learn to feel when the full moon was near, and when it passed, it was a clock, not for controlling time, but remembering its patterns. What Baghdad forgot us centuries past. The memory of this strange device and others like it faded. By the Ottoman period, Baghdad was no longer a center of astronomical innovation. The newer rulers brought their own methods, often imported from Western Europe. Mechanical clocks replaced water clocks, brass escapements replaced floating corks, precision replaced observation. But something else was lost to something harder to name. It wasn't just the technology, it was the intimacy. Baghdad's timekeepers had once shaped devices to fit their surroundings: sundial that only worked in one courtyard, a shadow chart that only made sense from one minaret, a calendar that adjusted for birdsong, lantern smoke, and the sound of footsteps at dawn. They weren't trying to conquer time, they were trying to understand it. Where they were when the world standardized time. It gained something, but lost this. Connection. Time became abstract, and the clocks stopped whispering. The hidden tradition in Cairo. It's easy to assume that when Baghdad's clocks fell silent, their story ended, but a small group of scholars in Cairo's Al-Azhar University continued to reference Baghdad's old models for centuries after the city's fall. One teacher, Al-Hanafi, compiled obscure timekeeping diagrams that included water table gradients and temperature-compensated shadow lines. He credited the techniques to our ancestors in the two rivers. It's a poetic name from Mesopotamia. In the margins of his manuscripts, he wrote, "Do not seek to divide time as if it were your servant. Instead, ask time how it wishes to be known." Even in the 1700s, Cairo's muezzins were trained in Baghdad-style observational methods before they were allowed to use mechanical clocks. They learned to count breaths between echoes, to judge our angles by eye, to wait for shadows to fall. Just so and so for a few more generations. Baghdad's water clocks survived not in wood or copper, but in human muscle memory. Then, quietly, that too passed. One last clue in the desert in 1936. A British team surveying abandoned Ottoman military outposts near the Tigris stumbled across a curious slab of limestone. Buried beneath sand and brush, the top was etched with what looked like concentric arcs and dots. At first, it was assumed to be a navigation table or map, but one archaeologist, trained in Arabic script, noted that the marks weren't maps. They were calibration arcs meant to chart shifts in shadow length by season. The slab had once been a horizontal light clock, likely paired with a now lost wall-mounted gnomon. Its markings were too fine for casual time telling. This had been built for something precise. Buried nearby was a broken lead funnel and a small copper cup with a crescent scratched on its base. The team cataloged it and moved on. But for those who knew the patterns, it was unmistakable. It was one of the last survivors of Baghdad's water wheel lineage, still buried, still forgotten, still waiting. The city that let time pass quietly. Most great cities of the ancient world left behind monuments, empires, or religions. Baghdad left behind a philosophy of time. It taught that time could be watched, but didn't need to be ruled. That machines could serve not to control, but to listen. That even the flow of water, the swing of wind, or the quiet exhale of a night garden could help us mark our place in the universe. And perhaps, if you stop long enough, if you step away from alarms, deadlines, and flickering screens, you might still hear what the old wheel once said. Not a chime, not a bell, just the breath of something patient, waiting, listening, marking the hours, not because it must, but because someone, somewhere, still remembers to ask, what time is it? Really? Really? Long before trains demanded punctuality, before factory bells synchronized the rise of entire cities, and long before wristwatches ticked out seconds like anxious metronomes, there was a village that marked time by sound, shadow, and the slow rhythm of trees. It wasn't an important village, not in the way empires remember. It had no palace, no battleground, no cathedral, just thatched roofs, uneven footpaths, and a wooden pole in the center of a square. But for nearly 300 years, this pole served as a community's calendar, clock, and season keeper. Not by numbers, but by what it cast. Its shadow, falling across etched stones, told the villagers when to sow, when to rest, when to bury the last of winter's grain, and when to prepare for the thinning of autumn's light. And then, one day, without warning or ceremony, the pole disappeared, and with it, time, not all time, not the turning of the earth, but their time, the time that made sense here, in this place, with these winds and these hills. And slowly, the village forgot when it was. Not in the dramatic sense. There was no panic, no cries of madness, just a creeping dislocation, like a book that's lost its table of contents, a year without chapters, a people unmoored from their own rhythm. Let's drift back, gently, to when it began. A village of no name. The village appears in a 14th century, its Flemish tax record as Terra Communa in Valle Obscura, the communal land in the shaded valley. No formal name is listed. Local oral tradition, recorded centuries later, refers to it simply as Het Stilhorlich, literally the silent timepiece. The village sat nestled in a fold of land between two minor ridges, south of what is now Liege in modern-day Belgium. Its placement meant it received uneven sunlight throughout the year, making traditional sundials or bell towers unreliable for tracking time. And so, sometime in the late 1200s, a craftsman, possibly a monk or a visiting builder, erected a wooden gnomon or shadow pole in the center of the clearing. Round it were laid 12 hand-cut stones, each etched with a symbol: a sheaf of wheat, a snowflake, a bare tree, a fish, and others whose meanings were known only to those who stood among them every day. This was not a calendar in the Roman sense, with months and fixed weeks. It was not a clock in the Arabic sense, with ratios and gearwork. It was more like a shared memory, coded into timber and stone. As the pole's shadow crept and shortened, then lengthened again, the villagers would know to adjust their routines. When to pull stored herbs from the rafters, when to dry meat, when to stop planting root vegetables. Over time, the ritual became instinctive. Children would learn by watching. Elders would point, not to numbers, but to light. No one ruled the clock. It ruled no one. It simply reminded the theft that was in one, according to a monk named Bernard, who visited the village in 1343 and later wrote about it in a side note of a much larger treatise on river trade. The shadow pole was treated with quiet reverence. No prayers, no blessings, but it was not to be leaned upon, nor disturbed. It had no name, no inscription, but it was never forgotten until one winter. There are no surviving documents that explain why or how the pole vanished. There are only Eco's vague references in church letters, a local farmer's scratched note about no mark on Candlemas, and later, a regional priest's complaint that the village no longer observes the calendar and requires intervention. Some say the pole was taken as firewood during a harsh winter. Others suggest it was stolen by travelers who mistook it for a sacred relic. But one theory, preserved in the notebook of a traveling notary named Gilbricht, suggests something stranger. The folk speak of the marker that slipped into the earth, that it grew tired of standing. A poetic invention, most likely, but in a village with no clocks, no calendars, and no formal education. The idea that time itself might leave felt no more outlandish than the rising of the sun. How time fell apart the months after the pole disappeared. Villagers continued their tasks. Kay baked, tilled, carried water, and cleaned chimneys. But soon the rhythms diverged. A neighbor harvested too early. Another sowed while the frost still lingered. Its linen was washed on what had once been a feast day. Funerals and weddings clashed without warning. The effects were not immediate, nor were they dramatic, but over years, harvests declined. Children born in one season were misaligned for the next. Certain herbs were missed in their windows. Trades with nearby towns became confused. Market days missed, holy days disrespected, and slowly the village withdrew, not in defiance, just in uncertainty. Without shared time, even conversation became unmoored. What day is it? What season are we in? Answers once given by pointing to the shadow on the stone now required guesses, arguments, or appeals to memories that didn't always match. Eventually, villagers stopped asking. They just did things when they felt it was time, but no one agreed on when that was. The visit that came to Leighton, 1379. A new priest was assigned to the region. His name was Mathages of Dinant. He was young, energetic, obsessed with restoring order to villages that had, in his words, fallen from the common drumbeat of the church. Upon arriving at the unnamed village in the valley, he was bewildered. There were no public timekeepers, no bells, no festivals observed properly. Even the Easter Mass was held on the wrong day. He inquired. The villagers shrugged. We lost a stick. No one remembered the carvings. No one could recall where the shadow had landed on midsummer. No one knew how to rebuild it. Matthijs attempted to install a church bell to replace the lost sense of time. It tolled once, then twice, but no one came. Time, once communal, could not be reimposed from above. Not here. The calendar that wasn't in his final letter before being reassigned. Mathages wrote, "They are peaceful, industrious, but unreachable. Their calendar is wind. Their clock is the ache in their knees. I have met a people who live without time, and they do not seem to mind." And so the village continued. UNTMED. Unmarked, uncounted. Even after the village was eventually absorbed into a larger parish and renamed. Even after a stone bell tower was erected 2 centuries later, the residents continued to refer to the original clearing as the place where time left. No monument, no pole replaced, wind and memory. And those 12 stones, half buried now, cracked with frost, still there, waiting for a shadow that would never return. By the time the 15th century arrived and swept its plagues and pilgrimages across Europe, the village in the shaded valley had become an oddity, spoken of with quiet fascination by local priests and distant notaries. A place where people lived without proper time, where bells didn't ring, where no one agreed when the week began. But for the villagers themselves, life simply continued just without noon. not metaphorically. They had mornings, they had evenings, they had meals, work, births, and deaths, but they no longer had noon. There was no longer a single moment when everything paused and aligned. No midpoint, no anchor, no lunch bell, no sun-high silence where even chickens seemed to sleep. Instead, people just ate when hungry, rested when tired, visited neighbors when the wind felt right, and over generations, they stopped even using the word for noon. The Latinized merides vanished from speech. Even its local equivalent, Middelken, the Low Dutch dialects, began to drift out of meaning. If you asked a child what time it was halfway through the day, they might say, "It's not morning anymore. The light has changed. It's time to turn the hay." There was no point anymore in placing labels on hours. The problem with bells were one of the great instruments of time in medieval Europe. A bell tower meant order. It regulated fields, shops, prayers, weddings, and curfews. It was how a bishop could command silence in a town without being present. It was how farmers knew when to stop threshing and begin mending fences. But the shaded village had no bell tower, or rather, it did, but it didn't matter. In 1451, after a long campaign of persuasion and 2 generous donations from wealthier neighboring parishes, a wooden bell frame was finally erected on the higher northern ridge. It stood taller than any other structure in the village and held a single bronze bell that had been transported with great difficulty by ox cart from Dinant, the priest in charge. An aging man named Peter van Beers described it with pride in his letters. "They have returned to the circle of time. The bell shall toll thrice daily, marking matins, sext, and compline." But it didn't work. The villagers heard the bell, yes, but they did not respond to it. The morning bell rang out, but no one rose early. The midday bell rang, but no one stopped to eat. The evening bell echoed over the roofs, but children still played in the fields. The sound meant nothing to them. They did not reject it. They simply had no reflex left to respond. Time had ceased to be communal centuries ago. It could not reinstall a rhythm once forgotten, not with bronze and rope. Van Beers, encouraged, left the village within a year. The bell frame collapsed 2 winters later during a storm. No one rebuilt it. The bell itself was taken down and stored in the church's cellar, where, presumably, it still sits. The last known calendar in 1479, traveling scholar named Theodoric van Mechelen stopped in the village while gathering material for a compendium of regional calendars and agricultural customs. He was especially interested in how rural communities adapted the church's formal calendar to local geography. What he found, however, puzzled him. There were no calendars. The villagers did not own almanacs or printed date wheels. They did not mark saints' feast days. They could not tell him when Lent would begin or when Easter had last occurred. He asked when they celebrated Christmas. They shrugged. One man pointed to the stars. Another said, "When the trees are stiff." A third said, "When the big frost comes." Theodoric stayed 3 weeks, attempting to trace any pattern or shared framework. He found none. Each household seemed to follow its own unwritten clocksum, aligned loosely with moon phases. Others by the feel of soil or the habits of animals. One widow told him, "The birds tell me when to bless the soup. They come close to the window, and that's when I know." It wasn't a joke. For them, time had become deeply sensory intuitive rather than calculated. No gears, no bells, no tables of days. Theodoric later wrote, "They live as mushrooms do in response to damp and light, rather than rule or number. And yet, their harvest is steady, their children grow, and their dead are mourned in due order." The disappearance of birthdays. The centuries turned. One more curious effect emerged: the slow erosion of birthdays. Villages across Europe, though far from universally literate or precise, still marked the days of their birth in some form, if not exact dates. then at least the month, or the saint's day closest to it. But in the shaded village, that custom simply didn't persist. By 1602, according to a local parish clerk's exasperated note, not a single resident could tell him their birthday, not because they had forgotten, but because they had never been told. Children were born, of course, but the date was often lost or seen as irrelevant. Instead, people were described by context. He was born the year the frost cracked the cider barrel. She came during the rains that washed away the bridge. He was born to lambings after the fire. Time was remembered by texture, not by sequence, and birthdays slowly vanished as a category. It was not until the arrival of Napoleonic civil record keeping in the early 1800s that official dates were forcibly recorded again. But by then, the villagers had gone centuries without ever asking, "How old are you?" It simply didn't matter. You were old when your knees told you. You were young if your breath was still steady after running uphill. And you were middle-aged when people stopped giving you instructions but hadn't yet started asking your advice. A rhythm lost, a rhythm found centuries later in the early 20th century. A folklorist named Helene Brabant came to the now modernized village by then bearing the name Veld Horse 2 Catalog. What little remained of pre-industrial customs, she interviewed elderly residents who still remembered their grandparents speaking of the years before the bell. One woman, born in 1859, remembered being told, "Back then, we woke by the shape of the sky. The sky would turn a certain silver, and then it was time to gather nettles." Another said, "My great-grandfather never learned to read the clock. He said the sun did enough reading for him." Abana asked if any traditions from the unclocked time remained. The old villagers thought. Then one man said, "There's a certain feeling when the air is thin and you know you should stop working, even if there's light left. We call it shadow work, shadow hour. It's not a time, really, just something in the body." We all still have it, a question that still echoes today. Veldhorst has clocks, calendars, church bells, and streetlights. The rhythms of global commerce have reached even this once forgotten valley. Children go to school by schedule. Markets are held on Saturdays, and birthdays are printed on certificates. But in a quiet clearing just east of the modern village, there's a low, worn circle of stones. 12 of them, no inscriptions, no pole in the center, just a depression in the grass where something once stood. Locals call it the Platzwar, Tieged Wegging, the place where time left. No one knows who named it that, or when, or why the phrase stuck. And sometimes when the sky is just the right silver, and the air grows still, an elderly farmer walking past will pause, glance at the center of the ring, and murmur, "It's not morning anymore, not a fact, not a time, just something remembered." By the time the modern era arrived, trains with their timetables, schools with their bells, factories with their shifts, the village had already become a curiosity, a place where time had once slipped gently without protest, and then stayed, gone, like a door quietly closed in a room no one noticed missing. The people of the valley had lived for generations without formal hours, without clocks, without shared, agreed-upon noon. And even as the outside world became precise, digitized, and punctual, something in the rhythm of this place resisted reabsorption. Time here never quite felt like it ticked. It rustled. It shifted like tree branches in the wind. It followed the sound of birds, or the way a certain kind of cold wind meant bread dough wouldn't rise right, and so there was no point baking that morning. Time was felt, not read, and that was hard to explain to census takers, map makers, priests, or civil servants when they came to draw new boundaries, build rail connections, assign administrative codes to parcels of land. They would ask simple questions. What time do the fields begin work? What is your earliest recorded harvest? When does winter start here? And always, The answers came when the hands feel it. After the third fog that doesn't lift. When the old dogs sleep indoors. The visitors laughed with puzzled expressions. Sketchbooks full of hesitant notes. And the strong sense that something in this village had grown sideways from the rest of the world. As if time, like a sapling, had been trained to grow not straight and upward like the others, but low to the ground, curling beneath the brambles, surviving in its own strange shape. The failed arrival of Precision 1894, a government engineer named Romain Delphus, attempted to install a mechanical clock in the village's renovated schoolhouse. It was not a grand endeavor. It was part of a standardized national project. Every school across the province was to receive a bell clock, wound weekly, intended to ring precisely at 8, 12, and 3. Simple, harmless, and yet the school children here cried when it rang, not out of fear, but because it startled them in a way they could not describe. The ringing felt wrong, not like the far-off chime of church bells from a distant town, which they could ignore or reinterpret. This was inside their space, an alien rhythm in their wooden-walled world. The teacher, a gentle woman named Madame Ayrton, noted that attendance dropped after the installation. Children who once drifted in naturally during the early light now stood outside, unsure whether to enter after the new noise. Some walked away altogether. One child, Willem, refused to sit beneath the clock. He said it made his ears itch and his head feel out of place. Eventually, Madame Ayrton covered it with a cloth, and he calmed. After 3 weeks, she stopped winding it altogether. Key went missing. The chimes grew silent. The machine simply sat, frozen at 12:02, as if even it had no desire to divide. The day. Romain Delphus, frustrated, wrote in his final report, "The mechanical rhythm could not take root. This village repels timekeeping like oil repels water." The calendars that came to late calendars too were eventually brought in. Printed ones, hanging ones, the kind that were supposed to show planting dates, moon phases, saints' days, and legal holidays. Some were pinned to the walls of the town hall. Others were given freely at the baker's shop or sent through mail with government newsletters. But few were used. Fewer still were read. When asked why, one elderly miller shrugged and said, "The moon doesn't change just because the page." Despite the 1920s, younger villagers, especially those who had left for military service or education and returned, tried to modernize the way time was spoken of in the village. They began naming birthdays again, trying to plan festivals on proper dates, holding meetings at set hours. But the older residents found it odd. Why celebrate the longest day on a day that feels short? They asked. Why gather at 6 o'clock when the light is not yet ready? Attempts to enforce regularity fell flat. It was as if the village had muscle memory for drift, not schedule. The place in the forest deep in the trees northeast of the village was a grove once known as Stillwood. Still wood. No roads went through it. Even now, satellite images show a darker, denser patch in that region. Inside the wood was the old circle of 12 stones mentioned in the last section, the place where time left a toe. But that was not its original name. In older oral records, passed down by shepherds and field tenders, the place was called Vervlocht Uur, the woven hour. Why? No one knows. Some say it was where lovers once met between their farms. Others say it was the site of a ritual long forgotten where the people would exchange objects to mark the change of seasons. Others believe it was where clocks were buried. This last idea comes from a strange local tale told by a 19th century seamstress named Leon J. Halvwitt. Her great-grandfather, she claimed, had once attempted to bring a pocket watch to the field for fun. He had been given it by a traveling merchant in return for eggs and cheese, but when he tried to use it to time the milking of cows or the baking of rye bread, everything went wrong. He overboiled cream. His bread was underbaked. The cows, disturbed by the clicking sound, gave less milk. Eventually, he threw the watch into the trees. According to Lianjie, he said it sank into the ground without a sound, and the birds started singing again. It is, of course, a story, possibly imagined, but it speaks to something deeper, that in this village, timekeeping wasn't just unused. It was unwelcome. When the clocks finally came, time finally arrived, in full, loud, and industrial form, with the railway in 1931. A narrow-gauge train line was extended to within a few kilometers of the village. Though it never pierced the valley directly, the station was close enough that villagers began to coordinate with its arrivals and departures, and with that coordination came hours. For the first time, it became important to know whether something was happening at 3:15 or 4:10. Letters began, including dates. Shops started opening from 10 to 5. Schools adopted standardized hours, and just like that, the long, strange breath of timelessness ended. Not all at once, but with a creeping certainty of tracks through a field. The children born after 1935 never knew a day without clocks. Those born before still tried, for a while, to live as they had dressing when the light turned white, baking when the smell of soil changed. But the split was permanent, a rift in the rhythm. Eventually, no one spoke of the woven hour anymore. The circle of stones in the forest became overgrown. The village got a post office, then a supermarket. By the 1970s, it was just another rural town, efficient, tracked, timed, a quiet remnant. Something lingers. Even today, visitors to the area report a strange sense of pause upon entering the valley. Not a superstition, but a sensation. As if the air becomes heavier or gentler, as if things breathe differently here. A Dutch poet named Jara de Vries once spent a summer in the region and wrote, "Here, I lost my watch, or perhaps it lost me." Days did not pass, they folded. Mornings were suggestions, not announcements. It was not sleep that claimed me at night, but the slow hush of the world asking me to rest. She later named her collection of poems, The Village Without Noon. The final question, what is time, really? We live by it, chase it, fear it. But what happens when the people decide not to? Tease, not in revolt, not in protest, but simply through forgetting. What does it do to the body when bells never ring? What does it do to memory when years pass without birthdays? And what does it mean that, even now, in a village long since brought into the fold of modernity, someone, somewhere, still walks into the old forest grove on a silver morning, stands in the quiet ring of stones, and listens for a sound that never comes? It's a place where time left. Did it leave? Or did it stay, waiting for us to remember? The island of Rhodes, like many places in the Aegean, carries its past, not in memory, but in limestone. Beneath the walls of its old town, behind layers of whitewash and sea wind, lies a kind of dust that remembers more than any scroll. But not all that is remembered is understood, and not all that was buried was meant to be found in the quiet curve of a harbor, where the sun rises, pale and indifferent, over 1,000 years of forgotten footsteps. Divers once found something strange, something that didn't belong to the sea, something that clung to coral in a way only man-made things do, a corroded mass of green and brown, tangled like seaweed, but far heavier. It was removed from the wreck of a Roman-era merchant vessel in the early 1900s, raised alongside amphorae and coins, so encrusted that no one could tell what it was. At first, they assumed it was part of an anchor, a tangle of metal dot, but over time, slowly scientists and historians came to realize they had found something extraordinary, what would later be called the Antikythera mechanism. Though it had no name when it was built, no instruction manual, no labels, just fragments and gears. So many gears. Some say it came from Rhodes, Others suggest it merely passed by. But one thing was clear. This machine built before Christ, built before paper mills, before gear systems became common, was not a tool for war or harvest or building. It was a tool for time and for the stars and for something else, to something far stranger. The machine shouldn't exist. Let's take a moment to imagine the world this machine came from. It's the 2nd century BCE. The Romans are expanding. The Greeks are no longer at their golden height. But Rhodes, this island between Crete and Asia Minor, still thrives as a hub of learning, mechanic curiosity. Somewhere on this island, or near it, someone made a device with dozens of interlocking bronze gears, all arranged in a compact wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. It had dials, scales, inscriptions, and it could do something remarkable. It could predict eclipses. It could track the movements of the sun, the moon, and possibly the 5 known planets. It even accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon using a Penang slot gear system that wouldn't be reinvented for nearly 1,500 years to this day. There is no other known mechanism from that era for centuries after that shows this level of mathematical and mechanical sophistication, not from Egypt, not from Rome, not from India or China. This device appeared, then it vanished like a whisper in bronze, the workshop that was never founded. That brings us back to Rhodes, because while the mechanism was found off the coast of Antikythera, other Greek island, the craftsmanship, the mathematical knowledge, and the dialect of the inscriptions all suggest strong ties to Rhodes. Why Rhodes? Because in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Rhodes was home to a powerful school of engineering and astronomy, centered around the city's famed library and astronomical observatory. It was also the home of Hipparchus, one of the most advanced astronomers of the ancient world. He developed early models of the moon's motion and trigonometric tables, both of which seem encoded in the Antikythera's device. But here's the strange part. No workshop has ever been found. No tools, no partial devices, no schematics, writings that describe how to build such a thing. No apprentices. No follow-up models. Nothing. It's as if the knowledge required to build it bloomed suddenly, was used exactly once, and then disappeared, even on Rhodes itself. No evidence has emerged of the kind of workshop that would have needed multiple metalworkers, mathematical specialists, and precision tools capable of crafting gears with precise, triangular teeth smaller than a fingernail. If such a place existed, it must have been buried, forgotten, or perhaps erased. Why? That's the question that keeps historians pacing quiet museum halls at night. A machine that told the wrong kind of truth, the Antikythera mechanism, if we trust reconstructions, did something strange. Not only did it predict eclipses and lunar phases, but it also tracked cycles the ancients believed were tied to fate. Agriculture. Vascula. There was a Metonic cycla, 19-year period, after which lunar phases repeat on the same days. There was a Saros cyclus to predict eclipses with astonishing accuracy. And then there was a lesser-known cycle, the Kalipek, and possibly a gear for the games, cycle suggesting it may have tracked when the Olympic Games would occur. In other words, this was not just a scientific device, it was a calendar of belief, a mechanical priest, a device that could show when omens might occur, when light would vanish, when shadows would cover the sun, and when gods real or imagined might take notice. And in that sense, it may have crossed a line, because if a machine could predict what the stars would do, where did that leave the priests? Where did that leave prophecy? What happens when the machine says, this is not a miracle, it's math? Perhaps that's why no more were built. Perhaps someone realized it was better if the gods remained mysterious. Better if eclipses meant something. Better if the hours stayed loose, the stars untethered, and the people still looked upward with fear. not comprehension. The stone and the sand roads is made of stone. Its streets are paved with it. Its walls are carved from it. Its hills are full of quarries, and its ruins stretch like lazy vines over broken foundations and staircases that lead nowhere. Somewhere beneath, there may still lie another piece of the puzzle, a gear, a tool, a fragment with lettering no one has yet read. But excavations are difficult. Much of the old city is now layered beneath Ottoman walls, Byzantine chapels, and Crusader fortifications. Dig is to go through everything at once a time, sandwiched too tightly pressed to pull apart cleanly. Still, whispers remain. Fishermen in the 1950s told stories of brass gears found tangled in nets near Rhodes Harbor. Children in the 1930s claimed a workshop once stood where the seawall now ends. Its stones washed away long ago in a storm. And there's the strange account of a German archaeologist during World War II, who sketched what he believed were gear impressions in a slab near the Acropolis of Rhodes. He was never able to return, but the sketch was lost. But the rumor lingers. The sea keeps its own clock. There's one last detail, and it's easy to overlook. The ship that carried the Antikythera mechanism wasn't going to war. It was a merchant ship, a hauler of bronze, glass, wine, and cargo. The device, by all accounts, was cargo, too, possibly headed to Rome, where Greek knowledge was being collected like trophies. But the ship sank, and with it, the machine. The sea kept it for 2,000 years, longer than most cities have stood, longer than any emperor reigned. When it was finally pulled from the water, broken and barnacled, it had already outlived the civilizations that forgot how to make it, and even now, we don't know how it worked. Not fully, not really, because it wasn't meant for us. It was meant for a world where bronze whispered what the stars would do. A world that blinked and buried it, buried it. There's a quiet moment that happens in every museum, just before the glass cases hum with cleaning polish, and just after the guards have changed shifts. A stillness hangs in the corridors, as if the objects themselves have exhaled. In one of those rooms, a fragment sits under dim light, bronze, darkened by time, still cradling the imprint of those same ancient gear teeth, precisely cut, impossibly old. This is fragment A of the Antikythera mechanism. Key, so delicate, it had to be X-rayed by a machine usually used for aircraft components. It's cracked, missing, pockmarked by rust, but the patterns are undeniable. Tiny teeth, circles, levers that once turned with purpose. And it's not alone. Other fragments, some flat like lids, others thick like small wheels, were cataloged in Athens long after their retrieval. For decades, they were misunderstood, mistaken for nothing more than corroded scraps. It took generations of slow, careful observation to realize that they belonged together, that they were once part of a whole, a device, a machine, one not meant to survive. And yet, here it was. But what exactly was it doing? And why was it on that ship? The inventory that didn't list it, the shipwreck off Antikythera, is still being studied today. First discovered in 1900 by sponge divers who weren't even looking for history. It became the source of statues, ampery, and finely worked glassware. The cargo suggested wealth, trade, not piracy, not war. There were luxury items, bronze sculptures, and carved furniture. Whoever had paid for this ship to be loaded, they expected their goods to be admired in a villa or palace, not sunk in silence. An inventory would likely have existed, wooden tablets marked in wax, tucked safely with the ship's captain. But nothing of the sort was recovered. Still, based on the contents, archaeologists have deduced that the cargo was bound for the western Mediterranean, possibly to Italy, possibly even to Rome. Here lies the mystery, because nothing else on the ship was like the Antikythera mechanism. Not even remotely. No other scientific instruments. No spare parts. No backup copies. Just this single device, possibly packed in a wooden case, nestled among the cargo of luxury goods, as if it were just one more item of trade. But this was not a wine jug. This was not a statue or a lamp or a coin hoard. It was a calendar, a planetarium dot, a celestial computer. So why was it alone? Did the buyer understand what they were buying? Or had they simply wanted a curiosity? The lack of any similar device in the inventorial, in any shipwreck before or after, suggests one of two things. Either these devices were extremely rare, or they were deliberately hidden from widespread use. Either way, it had no label, no stamp, no builder's mark, no explanation. It wasn't just buried in sea and salt. It had been erased. The gearmakers silence one theory, often whispered among historians of ancient engineering, is that the Antikythera mechanism was made by a single master one man, or perhaps a small team, who knew something others did in single quotes, but how to calculate time, and more importantly, how to translate time into motion. Some believe this maker was a follower of Hipparchus, the great Rhodian astronomer. Hipparchus had described the eccentric orbit of the moon and proposed early versions of trigonometric tables. He had spent his life studying how the heavens moved, and it's possible the Antikythera mechanism reflects those studies translated from chart to gear. Others point to Posidonius, another Rhodian thinker who operated a school that taught astronomy, physics, and ethics to Roman elites. He's known to have created a mechanical globosphere that could simulate planetary motion. Could this mechanism have come from his workshop? Or was it older? Was it made by someone not recorded an apprentice? A craftsman? Someone who never wrote anything down because they were too busy building? The silence around its origin is almost eerie in a culture that loved inscriptions, temples, coins, statues. This machine has none. Was the maker forgotten? Or were they made to be? The gears themselves. Let's talk about the gears, because this is where the story truly boggles the mind. The largest preserved gear in the Antikythera mechanism has 223 teeth each, one carefully triangular with a consistent pitch. The other preserved gears interlock with astonishing precision. Some gears are stacked, others are linked by axles and rods, allowing for movement in multiple directions. One gear uses a pinion slot mechanism to account for the moon's slightly erratic speed across the sky. Something we now know results from its elliptical orbit. The complexity is astounding, and here's the most striking fact. Nothing like it would appear in the archaeological record. Again, for over 1,000 years, when medieval clockmakers in Europe began building astronomical clocks in the 14th century, they were praised for their innovation, but none of them came close to the miniaturization and sophistication of this ancient device. The Antikythera mechanism was, by all appearances, a technological singularity, a peak, and then a disappearance. Was it simply too complex, too expensive, tied to knowledge systems that fell out of favor? Or was it intentionally kept secretite's very existence dangerous? We don't know, but we do know this. The gears were made to move in cycles, not just daily or monthly, but ecliptic, saros, metonic, callippic, time upon time. Wheels within wheels, and at the center of it all, a kind of humility, because the machine wasn't pretending to control the cosmos. It merely followed it, quietly, patiently, faithfully, and then it waited. The missing dial's recent studies using X-ray tomography and surface imaging have revealed something else. Behind the main gear plates were inscribed spiros calendars with tiny Greek lettering. On one dial, eclipse predictions. On another, phases of the moon, and possibly a dial tracking the 4-year Olympic cycle. This means the device wasn't just scientific, it was cultural. It knew when the games would be held, when eclipses might occur, when harvest festivals were due. It was a social timekeeper, not just a cosmic one, which raises another question. Who was meant to read it? Surely not the average farmer or merchant. The Greek inscriptions are complex. The device required understanding to interpret. So, was it made for a philosopher, a statesman, a school, or was it never meant to be widely used at all? One scholar described it as a demonstration piece, a teaching tool, perhaps, something meant to show the harmony of the heavens, not for practical use, but for awe. If that's true, it may have been one of a kind, a display, a model of the universe in bronze and thought. And if so, then we must ask, what happened to the rest? 'Cause a tool like this doesn't appear in a vacuum. It requires centuries of thought behind it, and possibly other prototypes, but none have been found, which leads to the most haunting thought of all. Was it smashed on purpose? The clock that broke time, the Antikythera mechanism, likely stopped working long before the shipwreck. Its fragments suggest wear, corrosion, maybe even a few missing parts before it was ever placed aboard the ship. Some suspect it broke. Others believe it was never completed. But there's a more curious theory that it was decommissioned on purpose, because by the time Rome absorbed Rhodes and Greek mechanical philosophy began to fade, knowledge itself became political. Devices that explained the stars too neatly began to unsettle belief. And in times of uncertainty, people prefer mystery. A machine that tracked the heavens too precisely may have undermined omens, priests, rituals. It might have challenged the divine order, and so, perhaps someone decided the machine was too dangerous to exist, and so they buried it. Not in sand, but in silence. It is the nature of water to carry things away. Coin, a shell, a sliver of wood, drawn by tide and gravity to the places no one intended. Time, too, does this. It drags events into deeper silence. It carries away names and leaves behind questions. And in a shipwreck off Antikythera, beneath a blanket of silt and barnacle crust, time carried a machine into oblivion, and it might have stayed there had a group of sponge divers in 1900 not taken shelter from a storm on a steep Greek island. Had one of them not seen something glinting below the waves? Had they not returned, first with curiosity, then with archaeologists to pull from the depths something they did not understand? For many years, the Antikythera mechanism sat forgotten. Again, this time in a drawer, misunderstood, mislabeled, ignored. Not because no one cared, but because no one knew what they were looking at. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that Derek J. de Sala Price, British physicist and historian of science, began to study the fragments in earnest. Using early X-ray imaging, he slowly traced the teeth of the gears, the symmetry, the placement. He published a groundbreaking article in Scientific American in 1959 titled "An Ancient Greek Computer," a phrase that at the time sounded almost absurd. A computer from 100 BCE, but the evidence was impossible to dismiss. And Price was not alone for long. The machine reborn in silence over the decades. More experts joined the effort. Engineers, classicists, horologists. In 2005, a team known as the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, made up of scholars from the UK, Greece, and elsewhere, brought in high-resolution imaging and surface scanning tools. They built digital models, ran simulations, translated inscriptions invisible to the eye, bit by bit. The mechanism yielded its secrets. They discovered that the front dials tracked the zodiac and solar calendar, showing the positions of the sun and moon. The back dials included a 19-year metonic cycle, a 76-year calyptic cycle, a 223-month Saros eclipse prediction cycle, and even a 54-year exeligmos dial to correct eclipse patterns, all encoded in bronze wheels no larger than a shoebox. The level of precision was staggering. Each cycle, each gear, each pointer had been crafted by hand to mirror the sky. It's not just that this machine could track celestial movements, it's that it predicted them. Who was it for? One of the most persistent questions about the Antikythera mechanism is its audience. So who would use such a device? It is too precise to be decorative. It's complex for a casual user. It's mathematical for a merchant, and too esoteric for an ordinary home. So, was it meant for a philosopher? Someone like Posidonius, who may have owned or commissioned it? Was it a teaching tool in an elite school of astronomy? Or was it a gift and offering from one court to another, perhaps sent across the sea to a Roman patron? A message in metal. This is what our civilization knows. If so, the message never arrived. The ship sank, and history lost a reply. The decline of Greek engineering in the wider view of history. The Antikythera mechanism stands not just as a marvel, but as a kind of warning. Because what came after was silence. That Greek mechanical innovation, once at its height with inventors like Casibius, Philo of Byzantium, and Hero of Alexandria, faded after the Roman conquest. Though the Romans excelled in architecture and infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, fortifications, they were not as deeply invested in delicate mechanical devices. They saw machines more for spectacle than study. As the centuries turned, war and fragmentation made survival, not scholarship, the priority. Workshops closed, libraries burned, and the knowledge that had once made the Antikythera mechanism possible began to drift out of reach. By the early medieval period, mechanical gears of such complexity had all but vanished from Europe. It would not be until the 14th century that comparable devices emerged: astronomical clocks in cathedrals, mechanical calendars in monasteries. But even then, they lacked the compactness, the portability, and the integrated astronomical functions of the Antikythera device. It wasn't just that the ancient Greeks had built something remarkable. It was that they had built something that no one else would manage again for over a millennium. The machine that measured meaning there is something profoundly human in the urge to count time. We do it obsessively. In days, in seasons, in centuries, we count down to events and count up from losses. But the Antikythera mechanism wasn't just counting. It was translating, turning the unknowable sky into something tactile. It took light from distant suns, the dance of planets, the sweep of moonsand, turned them into the turning of wheels. No magic, just math. But to the people of the time, it must have seemed like divination, a device that could tell you when to plant, when to harvest, when to worship, and when the sun would disappear behind the moon. Not by reading omens, but by reading gear. Ratios. Imagine the feeling of turning the crank, watching the dials move, the moon progress, the eclipses aligned. Imagine what it meant to know with confidence that time was a machine, and that someone, somewhere, had built a copy of it. What was buried and why the final fragments of the Antikythera mechanism tell us something unsettling. They were not all found together. Some were deep inside the wreck, others tucked under fallen statues, still more scattered across the seafloor. Marine archaeologists continue to uncover pieces, some as recently as 2022. Each new discovery changes our understanding slightly, but none answers the central mystery. Why was this machine the only one? As she came from a tradition of gear making, where are the others? If it was unique, why was it made at all? If it was one of many who destroyed the rest? There is no answer, only silence, just like the one that follows a question. No one dares to ask again. The clock that wasn't named in all the inscriptions found so far. There is no name on the device, no maker's mark, no proud attribution. This is unusual. Ancient craftsmen signed their work frequently, especially if it was innovative or beautiful. From potters to sculptors to metalworkers, many left marks or messages. But the Antikythera mechanism, nothing, no signature, no dedication. It may have been deliberate. To make a machine that predicts the will of the gods was a risky act. Perhaps its maker knew that anonymity was protection. Perhaps they feared that their knowledge would outlive their life. Perhaps they were right. Now it ticks again today. The Antikythera mechanism is no longer silent. Digital reconstructions, now existent interactive simulations that allow you to wind the gears yourself, virtually. Museums, house replicas, universities teach courses about its function and mystery, but the original still sits behind glass, motionless, a thing of bronze and silence. It doesn't tick, but somehow keeps marking time, not by movement, but by memory. Every tick of a modern watch carries the echo of its gears. Every calendar has its roots and its dials, and every time someone asks, how did they do this? The machine does exactly what it was built to do. It turns the sky into questions, and then waits for anyone to listen. Listen.